Hey guys, today I will be running you through a complete beginner's sculpting guide in Nomad Sculpt even if you have zero experience. I'll be running you through the user interface of how all of these tools work and how some of these sliders on the side work and how you could get started so that you can just get right into it and start sculpting. When you first open Nomad Sculpt, this is the scene that you should see. It might be a little bit different and menus might be in different spots, but more or less it's the same layout for everybody. To start off, we're going to look at all of these tools in the top right hand side. Again, it might be flipped for you, but for now I'm talking about this menu. These are all your basic tools, and these are how you are going to be manipulating your object to sculpt what it is that you want to sculpt. The clay tool is the first tool, and over on this side you can change the size of the brush radius and make it larger. And you can also change the intensity to change how aggressive that brush is going to make that manipulation. The clay tool is just going to bulk on a lot of material, and this tool you'll probably be using a whole lot when you're bulking out your main shapes. To undo, you can 2-finger tap. You can also redo by tapping 3 fingers. If you want to remove material instead of adding material, you can click the sub button to subtract material. The clay tool is probably one of the first tools you should get familiar with because this is how you'll bulk in a lot of your face shapes or anything that you might be doing. The next tool in the list is the brush tool, and this works a lot like the clay tool, but you'll notice that it feels a lot smoother as you're adding things in. It feels like it's more pushing it around than it is adding to it or taking away from. And you can use the sub function with this brush as well. The move tool is a tool that you will probably be using for the majority of your sculpt. We can move around our camera views using this Gizmo slider up here. We'll look at the right view and snap to it by clicking on it one time. You'll see that you can navigate those by tapping on it. And we'll have a bigger brush radius with a medium intensity. And then we can start moving in these shapes to try to get a head shape. And we'll squish it in on the side. And if we look down here, we can drag this out on the bottom to get a chin, and you can even use a smaller brush radius to do that just a little bit better. As I'm making these manipulations, you'll notice that everything is happening in symmetry. If you don't want to do that for whatever reason, you can click this SYM button to turn it off, and then you'll only be making manipulations to one side. With the move tool, there's no sub button, but there is a normal button. So while I'm moving this, you'll see that it moves wherever I want to go in any direction. However, if I have normal selected, it is only going to go in one direction. It's going to lock it into that direction. This could be pretty useful. The next brush is the drag brush, and this works a lot like the smooth brush, but the difference is that as you're making movements with your drag tool, it's going to keep updating where the origin point is so that you can drag out shapes rather than just moving. Whereas with the move tool, it's only going to move from where you originally grabbed it from, and it won't keep updating. The drag tool does not have that normal function like the move tool does. Up next is smooth. When you're bulking in shapes like I did with the eyebrows and nose, it's going to be really messy. That's when the smooth tool comes in handy. You can use smooth to just go over everything that looks very rigid and hard-edged, and you can soften everything up by smoothing it. Now we have the mask tool. With the mask, you can draw on your subject, and anywhere that is masked won't be manipulatable. So if I try to clay, it's not going to affect any masked areas. It'll go all the way around it. This also works with things like the Gizmo tool that we'll get to in the future, but just for a quick example, if I move things using the Gizmo tool, the things that are masked will not move. Another thing that you can use the mask tool for is if you open the mask tool settings at the top, there's a whole list of things that you can do. This will clear the mask. This is going to invert the mask right here so that if you make a selection, you can just invert it to select everything else. This will blur the edges of your mask, and this will sharpen them. This shell option here is for if you do any extraction that uses a shell, this will set the thickness of your shell, and you can do that in a positive or a negative direction. I like to use this feature a lot for armor. For example, if we set the thickness to a positive 0.5 or 0.8, we can go down and extract a shell, and you'll see that it takes that selection and it extracts it outward to that thickness. That might have been too thick. We could go in, turn down the thickness, and then extract another shell, and you'll see how this could be useful for armors. You also have this carve function, which will essentially take that selection and separate it from your base mesh, and it will carve a hole into the original mask. So if we move this out of the way, you'll see that it carved it out of the base mask. If you don't want a shell, you could also just extract the mask and you could fill it in. This will just kind of separate the entire shape. We can look at our extraction. We can open our scene menu up here, and this will have all of your objects in this menu. We'll cover this later, but you can click your extraction, click on Gizmo, and we can see that it made an extraction and filled it in. And lastly, for the mask tool, if you are in the mask settings, instead of a shell or filling, you could also split. And we're going to create this as a shell because it should hollow the inside of the shape, which is very useful for a lot of things. On our split function, let's go to shell and split these things. And then if we move this out of the way, you'll see the inside of this is now a shell. Up next is the select mask tool, and this is essentially just the mask tool. It just lets you create a mask in different ways. If you look over here, you can create a rectangle, and you can just put that in there however you want, or you could make it work as a square, not a rectangle. You can also make it center from where you're grabbing it. That's going to grow from the center. Auto validate will just be when you let go, it's going to auto validate. You could turn that off so that you could put your selection out, and then it's not going to go in there until you click the green dot. There's a few other ways you can get mask tools. You could use the lasso and just draw it in there however you want. You could also use a line. The line can be very useful. I use that a lot. The polygon lets you put out multiple points, and you can just keep dragging them in. If you want sharp edges, you can click the dot to get it go to a sharp point rather than a radial bend. And then when you click the green dot, it's going to put that mask in there. And the last one is an ellipse or a circle. And now we'll move on to the next tool, which is the paint tool. If you want to paint directly onto your object, that's when you'll use the paintbrush. And then you can click this paintbrush up here to select your colors. You have some pre-saved materials in here, and you can just select one of these, or you can click on the color icon here and select from a color wheel. When you have your color, you can change the roughness. The lower the roughness, the glossier it is, and the higher the roughness, the more matte it is. You can also change the metalness so that it looks more metallic or less metallic. Once you have it where you want it, you can go and paint directly onto your object, and you can change the size of your brush, of course. You can also change the opacity by changing the intensity. If you don't want to paint directly onto it and you just want to paint the whole object, you can go into your paintbrush up here and you can select paint all. For the purpose of the next brush, let's go ahead and just put a little bit of paint on here. And now let's talk about the smudge tool. This is just going to work for paint. It is not going to work for the actual object. If you have paint on something, the smudge tool will essentially push it around and blend it in. Up next, we have the flatten tool. When you have really round shapes and you don't want them, the flatten tool is what you're going to use. Let's say we don't want underneath the chin to be very round. We'll take that flatten tool and we'll just run it on the bottom for a little bit, and you'll see how it's kind of flattening off. Let's undo and redo so you can see the difference. And you'll just see that, like, if you do this enough, the flatten tool is really useful in a lot of situations. It's hard to explain, but the planer tool is a lot like the flatten tool. However, it's working a little bit differently. When you start at a location, I think it tries to cut everything out according to that location's maximum or minimum height. I think the minimum height. The layer tool is also really helpful for armor and things like that. When you are using the layer tool, it will add one layer onto it, and no matter how much you go over on the same stroke, it's just going to go to the same height. A higher intensity will make that go higher. And the same works when you are using this with the sub button enabled, to where it will cut into the model at a certain layer height. I forgot to mention about planar that you could also use the fill option so that instead of removing material, it will add material to that height. Let's move on to the crease tool. The crease tool is a tool that I use very frequently. It is really powerful and you should get used to using it. Just the normal crease tool without sub enabled will make an indent on your object. I use this to really bring out shapes. If I want to define the eyebrow, that's going to really help us define it. And maybe I want to define where the eyebrow ridge goes into the eye right here. That's going to really help you understand those shapes. Also, if for example, I wanted to define the nose ridge, I could separate that off of the face and it'll just make the nose much more apparent. Let's say you wanted to separate the top lip from the cheek. You could draw a line in here. And then alternatively, if you click the sub button, it will actually, instead of making an indent, it is going to bring everything to a point and make a sharp edge, which is also really useful. I like to use this for things like defining hard lines. Like if I want to define where the chin is, I will actually use that sub button and I will draw in that cheek line. And then I can go in and I can make manipulations. Like I could use the clay tool with the sub button and I could do things like start taking away some of the material behind the cheek line so that I can find those other shapes. It just helps me understand where things belong. For example, using the normal crease tool without sub enabled, you could draw in a line for the mouth so that you can separate those. And then you could click sub and that will help you easily draw in those defining lines to see where those lips belong. Up next, we have the trim tool. When you use the trim tool, you might notice this disclaimer down here. And if you want to use orthographic view, I actually suggest it. What I would do is open this panel at the top and you can select all of these to show up at the bottom menu right here. I will select perspective. And what this will do is it will let you change between perspective and orthographic view. The difference is that when you're in perspective, it is going to distort your view so that you're seeing the object the way that you see it in real life, but it's not like a true straight on view. Everything gets distorted a little bit. When you are using orthographic, it is not going to distort that view and you'll see it exactly straight on. So that when you use the trim tool, it's not going to distort how you trim things and it will give it a true front look. Whenever you need to be precise, I would recommend doing that in orthographic view and snapping to a viewpoint by clicking the gizmos at the top here. Trim is useful. You can trim in different ways, just like you could select mask in different ways. You can use your lasso, polygon, line, rectangle, or ellipse. And this will be a tool that you use pretty frequently. For example, if I wanted to make a rock, I would start by trimming this, and then I would take the line tool, and I would trim this in different ways. I would turn off the symmetry, and then I would just start looking at this from different angles, and continuously trim until I get shapes that I'm happy with. And eventually, you're gonna come up with something that looks more or less like a rock. The next is the split tool. When you want to separate parts of a single mesh, that's why you use the split tool. I'll take the lasso function to demonstrate, and we're going to lasso off some of this. And now what happened is, these are two separate parts that you could individually select. I have a setting turned off, so let me turn that on. In my settings menu, I have darken unselected object off, but I think by default, you probably have it on, and that will let you see your different objects in the scene, and the ones that you don't have selected will be grayed out. This is useful if you want to break one object into multiple parts so that you could 3D print it separately. Or maybe if I wanted to do something like make rubble, I could break these apart, and then I could make this look like it was destroyed a little bit on the corners, and I could use it for something like that, to where these two separate pieces broke into two distinct parts. The project tool works similar to the trim tool, but it does one thing distinctly different. So it looks like all it's doing is trimming away the material, but I'll turn on the wire so that you can see the mesh. And what's actually happening is it's not cutting it away. What it's going to do is take all of those vertices and it's going to squish them into the other object that is not getting projected. All of your vertices are still there. They're not cut. They're just squished in. I personally don't know what practical use cases this have. I don't use it, but it is there if you know why to use it. Now let's talk about the inflate tool. When you use the inflate tool, it's essentially going to evenly distribute material from the center of your brush radius as if blowing air into your object. It's not a tool to ignore. This is definitely one that you want to experiment with and see how you might use it. It is very useful. The pinch tool is going to take the radius of your brush and it's going to try to take all of those vertices and bring them all together. Alternatively, if you click the sub button for the pinch tool, it will take those same vertices and it's going to push them apart. Nudge tool is good for making slight manipulations to your mesh. It's good for doing things like ever so slightly changing the expression if you're doing a face, and just making small positional changes to some of those elements. Now let's talk about the stamp tool. This one is very important to understand. With the stamp tool, you can change your alpha map right down here. And when you start, you will have 3 default alpha maps, but you can always import your own images, which are just a black and white image that will determine how your brushes will displace the geometry on your model. If you go to this tutorial video that you're watching right now through my Patreon, I will upload all of these alpha maps that I have, and you can put those in your own folder. To do that, you'll simply download the folder of alpha maps that I'll provide you, go into your file browsing app, navigate to where the Nomad Sculpt files are on your device, open the Nomad Sculpt folder, and find the alpha maps folder and replace your alpha map folder with my alpha map, and make sure you bring all your files along too, unless you don't have any in here. And then once you have this folder, just go and reload Nomad Sculpt. Now let's talk about what the stamp tool actually does. I'll demonstrate by adding a scar. I have this wounds folder and I'll select this alpha map, which looks something like a scar. And we want to make sure, I'm going to look at the geometry. We want to make sure we have a fair amount of geometry. This is pretty good, but we are going to go into our voxel menu up here and we're going to voxel remesh the object with a high resolution, but not too high. I'll put mine at 485 and see what happens, and then I will voxel remesh. And you'll see we have a very dense mesh now with a lot of resolution, and here is what the stamp tool does. When we take that stamp tool and put it onto the model, it's going to add that texture and displace it onto your object. If I click sub, it will cut into the object and it creates what looks like some burned skin and a scar. I have a skin and scales folder as well. So you can stamp on what looks like the texture of skin, and you can just change the intensity of your brush size to make it more or less intense, and you can just do more subtle differences. And there's all kinds of textures to get all kinds of different results. You can do this by clicking sub to remove material and get it like to lower, or you can make sure that sub is not enabled and it will add that material. This alpha map right here will simulate the look of scales. So when you stamp that on, it will look something like that. And for this next tool, Del Layer, we're going to ignore this for now because it requires having layers and we're not going to worry about that. Honestly, for my purposes, layers is a feature that I don't really ever use. And now we move on to Tube Tool. Honestly, I could make a complete tutorial on just the Tube Tool and it would take a long time. But let's try to get through the basics so you can understand how important and how powerful the tube tool is. I use it in just about every single sculpt for a majority of the sculpt. When you want to originally put a tube out into your scene, you can do it in 2 ways. You can do it with a curve or a path. I usually use the path, but if you do a curve, you just draw the line and then it's going to put the points on where it thinks it needs to put them. You can see all these different points that we can go in and move. Or you can select the path option and you can lay out the point. And if you want, you can continue to add more points yourself. And when you have what you want, you click the green dot to get it to add to your scene. And now you can go in and further make changes to those points. You can click and hold on a dot to move it. And if you drag it onto a pre-existing dot, they will glow red, and when you let go, it will delete that point. If you want to add more points, you just click somewhere on the line and just drag, and it will just automatically add a new point. You can change your view to make sure you're moving these points at different angles, and you can make any kind of shape that you want. If you click on a point, it will turn it from white to black, and what that means is that it's going to make it snap to a radius instead of a nice smooth radial bend. This yellow dot at the end lets you change the radius of your tube tool. Up top is your edit menu, which will be available for any primitive shape, which is what a tube is considered before you validate it. While your tube is out and before you validate it, you will see this edit menu, and we're going to play with the radius. If we click radius, it's going to change it from 1 point to 2 points. This lets you change the radius at the start and at the stop of your tube tool. You could immediately imagine how this is good to make things like horns, and you could position that onto the head. And if you want it to show up on both sides, you would click mirror, and it will mirror that in a world symmetry like this. Additionally, you could click radius again until 3 dots show, and what happens is you'll be able to change the radius at every single point, not just the start and the stop. Now we have twist, and this most is used for the tube tool when you have a profile also selected, because if we do just the twist, it is twisting a perfect circle, so you're not going to see the difference. But if we click profile, it will turn it into a square to start. We'll cover the profile more in a moment. But now when I twist, you will see that it's actually making a change. If we click twist again, it is going to let you change the twist angle at the start and the stop, and you can start bending it a lot. Same with the radius. If you click it again until 3 dots show, you could change that twist at any point, and you can change it in any direction. Now with the profile, it's the same thing with the 1, 2, or 3 dots. So if you change it until 3 dots show, we can go into our profile by selecting this profile button. And what this does is it lets you change how that tube tool looks. If I make these changes, you can see that it's actually changing the profile of my tube. It's not a square and it's not a circle anymore. It's what I set the profile to be. You can see that the end of this profile, because I have 2 dots selected, you can see the end is the profile we just set, and this end is just a normal square. That's because we have the start of the tube tool as this shape, and we have the end of the tube tool as this shape. If we click profile again, we can change the profile at every point. We will see that our profile menu now lets us make every point and change that profile to whatever we might want it to be. B-spline is another important feature. Sometimes when you're making these bends in your model, you just want it to be a nice, smooth transition between every point, and it's hard to manually position it that way. If you click B-spline, it kind of averages all those out so that everything is nice and smooth of a bend. There's a few more features we can do with the tube tool. If you click these 3 dots up here, this is going to open what is called your topology menu. The big thing in here that I want to show you right now is called the spiral. You can click on spiral and you can turn up the twist angle, and it is going to start turning your tube tool into a spiral. You can change the radius of how far out that spiral goes, and you can change the scale of the entire spiral so that you can make it a thin spiral or a thick one. You can also change the angle offset to basically rotate the start and stop. Now let's look at the lathe tool. You can put out a new lathe tool with the curve or path option, just like the tube tool. And you can select fixed to make it a fixed line straight up and down, or you can turn fixed off and that line will happen wherever you put these points. You'll see that this is going to be that line right there where it puts a lathe around itself. For now, I'll use a fixed line, and I'm just going to put a path out and a couple points. I'll select the green dot to get it to show up. And now what's going to happen is this is just like spinning clay on a pottery wheel, and it's going to make that shape perfectly round. You can move your points and manipulate them in the same way that you would do that with the tube tool. And just like the tube tool, you can go in and click a dot to get it to snap to a radius, or don't click it and it will just be that smooth radial bend. You also have a couple features that you can change in the edit menu at the top. So if we select closed, it's going to connect the start and the stop of our points so that they're one closed shape, and you can use that to hollow out the inside in different ways and make it different radiuses all around. Or if we turn closed off and just let it be how it was, we could also select hole, and this is going to put a hole in the center. And you can also select hole again, and it will let you change the size of the hole at the top and at the bottom of your shape. You also have the B-spline feature for this so that it makes those radial bends average out. Now we have the insert tool, which can also be very useful. With the insert, it is going to take a shape and insert it into the position where you select on the current mesh. Starting from sphere, you can do any of these primitive shapes. If you just select a sphere and put it somewhere on here, it is going to place it, and then you can continue to place these objects. The same is true of any of these other primitive shapes. And when you select instance, what it is going to do is it will take your currently selected shape and it's going to make an instance of it, otherwise known as a copy, and it will instance that onto your object. Now let's look at the transform tool. You could use this to do things like clone, and you can clone this shape. You can also use this to scale your shape in different ways, or rotate it and move it. I don't use the transform tool often. Generally, I use the Gizmo tool to do all of my transformations. The Gizmo tool will be used very frequently. You can select these arrows on any axis to move your shape on that axis. If you select clone while moving, it will clone your shape. This outer band right here, this will scale it uniformly up or down. If you do any of these dots on any axis, it will scale it on that plane. These squares will let you move it freely on that plane, and you can do that with any plane. The very center dot right here is going to let you move it freely according to your camera angle, and it's not going to lock it into a specific plane. These inner bars will let you rotate it on that axis. The measure tool is pretty straightforward. You can just drag from point to point and you get a number, which I believe is in millimeters. And this will let you check proportions on your objects if you're trying to see what something is proportional to something else. If you select view, it's going to disable darken unselected object, and it will let you freely look around without any masks or anything like that. And then the select tool. With the select tool, you can use lasso, rectangle, or ellipse to come in and select the shapes that you want to select so that you can multi-select multiple things if you have a lot of objects in your menu. So if you wanted everything, you would just zoom out and make sure you select everything, and everything will be selected. This is useful when you want to use the Gizmo tool to move everything into a different position or scale it. That's it for all of these tools, but in the next video, I will go through all of these menus and I will show you the most important features inside of these menus to understand.